Okay, I'm told now we can begin. So hello and a warm welcome to this Guardian Newsroom event. My name is Paul Lewis. I'm Head of Investigations at The Guardian. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our panel and to this evening's discussion on the cost of the Crown, which is our series into royal wealth and finances. It's always good to meet with and talk to the people who read our journalism. So we're looking forward to a lively discussion tonight. It'll take about an hour. And if you've got questions for us, please make sure to ask them. You should see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button that if you click, you can ask your questions of us. Some of you have already submitted questions and we have those ready, so thank you for those. Right, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. It's a trio of talented reporters. They have spent weeks and months investigating this topic. The first person is David Pegg, who's our investigations correspondent. He has been the sharp tip of the spear of the investigation into the royal family for some time. Next, we have Maeve McClenachan, investigations correspondent. She has been doing a phenomenal series of podcasts. If you haven't heard them, Today in Focus, they started this week. We have a 5-episode series. And last but not least, Henry Dyer, investigative reporter. He's been investigating everything from royal stamps to royal cars. And together they have formed part of the team that have been behind the Cost of the Crown series. We've been looking into the subject for several months, and I thought a good way to start would be to tell you why we decided this would be a worthwhile subject for scrutiny. So David, why don't you kick us off with telling us why we set about investigating royal wealth and finances in the first place?
It's quite hard to think about now. You cast your mind back to September or October, it all feels slightly blurry. But I mean, I remember the discussions that we had around the time. So the death of a monarch is obviously a moment of great transition for the country, when the sort of position of the monarchy is being transferred from one person to another for the first time in decades. I mean, Elizabeth II's reign was very, very long. And with it, you're transferring the kind of role and responsibility of head of state. But we have been writing about issues relating to the monarchy for several years, and I think we'd always thought to ourselves that one of the elements of this that was sort of the most obscure and opaque and difficult to get to the bottom of was the family's private wealth as well. And so it's not just a moment of transferring the crown, it's a moment of transferring all of that wealth from one monarch to another. And so that, I think I remember we'd talked about this particularly with Rob Evans, who's another reporter on our team, about how we would sort of embark on looking at the question of the family's wealth and to what extent it was derived from their public position. But it has always seemed like this sort of absolutely vast and insurmountable mountain that you would never be able to quite scale. But the moment of transition from one monarch to another seemed like, as I recall, the right time to ask those questions and to do your best to take a kind of holistic look at it in a way that you might not otherwise simply be able to kind of carve out the space to do.
And you said that we had considered doing something like this before, which we had, I think, as far back as maybe even like late 2019, early 2020. We were discussing royal wealth and finances and how little scrutiny there has been up to now. But at that point, I think, David, I remember having a conversation with you, and actually we thought it might be too difficult.
Yes.
So explain why that is, why looking into a subject of this kind is such a challenge.
Well, two reasons really. I mean, the first is just that there's an enormous amount of secrecy surrounding it in a way that's very, very unusual, and is not quite the same sort of secrecy that we've tackled before. So I mean, previous projects that we've worked on, or that I've worked on, have been sort of offshore tax things. Other investigations into wealth, so stuff like the Panama Papers, where you've got a very large mass of information and it's a matter of doing your best to analyze it and understand it with a view to reaching the solutions. This is a very different kind of endeavor, where the information is kind of, you have no kind of bulk of information. It's not just that it's out there and it's just a matter of actually kind of crunching it as much as you can. I mean, it's obscured in ways that are sort of not really defined in law, and the assets are themselves diffused. It's not one question that we're interrogating. It's property, it's cars, it's stamps, it's jewelry, it's art, it's horses. All of these things require different kinds of expertise to interrogate, and they're all surrounded to different degrees by different layers of secrecy. And if you ask the palace for king's private wealth, they say it's a private matter, so we're not telling you, bluntly. I mean, and the second big difficulty is this tremendously blurred distinction between what is publicly owned and what is privately owned. So in a way that is totally unlike any other person in public life, because the king is kind of unlike any other person in British political public life, a huge amount of the assets that we associate with the family are in fact publicly owned, like Buckingham Palace. You know, he can't sell that. And then you have the things that are very clearly privately owned on the other hand, like Sandringham. But there's this huge kind of array of things in the middle where it's extremely unclear who actually owns it. And it's quite possible that actually they don't know in some instances, because they've just always been a part of the furniture in a sense. And nobody's ever stopped to sort of sit down and say to themselves, well, hang on a second, does the king own this, or does a member of the family own this as directly? So you're grappling with something that is both tremendously well obscured and also tremendously sort of inchoate and hard to grasp.
Okay, I want to get onto that blurring of the line between public and private in a second. I'll bring Maeve in on that topic, but before I do, David, just so people have a sense of this, when you say it's very difficult because of the amount of secrecy around the royal family, could you just elaborate on that point a bit? I mean, what are the sort of mechanisms of investigation that you would apply when you were looking into the wealth of another British individual who is a public figure, or what means of finding out information do you have when you're looking at other types of public bodies in the UK that you don't have when you're investigating the royals?
Well, there's all sorts of things, really. I mean, the first and most obvious one is the Freedom of Information Act. You know, you would expect to be able to chip away slightly at the edifice of secrecy by filing FOI requests to the government. Not necessarily for private information, but for information about what is taken from the public that relates to their public role. You can't do that with the royal family. The royal family is completely immune to the Freedom of Information Act. There is in terms of investigating somebody's sort of shares and investments, ordinarily those names would be disclosed on the register of a publicly listed company. With the Windsors, a shell company was set up at the Bank of England in the 70s, and for years that was used to obscure what actual shares and investments they had. I mean, nobody else really could use that other than heads of state, and it was really
you mentioned the death of a monarch and the transition to a new one, but in the case of the royal family, we don't have access to their wills.
Yes, and probably the most significant impediment to understanding private wealth of this particular dynasty in a way that would be entirely possible with others is that the wills are sealed by judicial decree when they die. Ordinarily, wills, once they go for probate, are made public. The Windsors uniquely, for the last 100 years, all of their wills have been sealed by judges.
Maeve, David mentioned this issue of the blurring of the line between what is publicly owned or owned, if you like, on behalf of the public by the sovereign, and what is private property of the Windsors, and disentangling those two. You've had this challenge, right, when you've been investigating artwork. Could you tell us a bit about that, what you understand as the distinction between public and private art, and how you went about trying to disentangle them?
Yes, so I was kind of thrown into this mix of the art world, of which I didn't know much about before, and it should have been fairly easy. So there's something called the Royal Collection, which is managed by an organisation called the Royal Collection Trust, and it has about 1 million different items, furniture, swords, but also a lot of artworks within it. So this is the kind of public collection, if you like. It's held in trust by the sovereign for the nation. They can't sell it off. It's kind of untouchable by the monarch, but it can be enjoyed by them. And this is a collection that includes the Rembrandts, the Vermeers, the dozens of Leonardo da Vinci drawings. This incredible collection. So we had a little look at that, and it turns out that, while in theory it's for the public, actually only a very small portion of those artworks are actually viewable anywhere that the public can see. And I had a great time using kind of reverse image searches and finding photos from private palaces, and finding these royal collection paintings on people, prince's living room walls. So a canaletto that was in Bagshot Park, just hanging behind Edward and Sophie as they sip their morning tea. So all that should have been public, and that should be nice and simple. And then separate to that, there's the private art collection. So we know that the Queen Mother and Prince Philip were both art aficionados, really, and also loved a bargain. And they would travel the world, buying things up, being given things, collecting and amassing this really quite grand private collection of art too. And Charles is, also an art lover and indeed an artist. So he's been adding to that. And so the Windsors have kind of amassed this really interesting private collection. There's no kind of inventory of that anywhere. It involved going through lots and lots of kind of exhibition guides and books and news clippings, and coming up with this list of nearly 400 individual artworks that we can look at. So kind of pride of place amongst those might be this Monet, which we know hangs in Clarence House in a kind of shady little corner of a living room, that the Queen Mother bought for the equivalent of about £110,000. And when we asked a valuation expert, they said it could bring in about 20 million today. Mm. So when you start to kind of add up the individual artworks within that, you get to this really impressive sum that we think has been handed on to King Charles without paying any inheritance tax.
And you mentioned that this was the Monet was a painting that the Queen Mother bought. Is that the case for all of their private collection of art, that these were purchased by the Queen Mother or Prince Philip or Charles?
No, and this is exactly where the line gets blurry between public and private, right? Because actually around a third of this list of 400 paintings that we found had been gifted to them. And in some cases, they've been gifted while on state visits or by kind of dignitaries or heads of state. And so questions then arise about whether those gifts that are given to them in their public role because of who they are, and often, during public engagements, whether they shouldn't be part of this public royal collection, whether it's really fair that they get included in a private collection and kind of bolster the coffers of this family. So, for example, one artwork we found was presented by Marc Chagall, the modernist painter. And he met Prince Philip at this event in Denmark in 1960 at this prize giving ceremony. Chagall was being given a prize, and he shows Philip round his collection, and then he presses into his hand this Bible that Chagall has illustrated with all of these beautiful watercolor and ink illustrations. And there's questions, according to the Royals gift policy, that feels like it's part of a state visit. It's kind of it could be considered an official gift. It should go into the public collection, but we find it displayed in Philip's private collection and exhibited as such. So there was numerous examples of that happening, that kind of grey space where they're exhibiting it as private, as if it's their personal work, but it's come to them into their very public position.
I think we correct me, you three, if I get this wrong, but I think we found examples of gifts that you could make a case were official gifts from other royal families or heads of state or on official occasions that had turned up in private collections, including the artwork you found, Maeve, but also some jewels, and a house in Edinburgh, and stamps, Henry, which was your wheelhouse on this project. Tell us a bit about those, because the royal family got a very valuable stamp collection.
Yeah, so Maeve was speaking earlier about the royal collection. This is completely different. This is the Royal Philatelic collection. It's over a century old. It was started by George V before he became king in 1910. His biographer said that for 17 years he did nothing but shoot animals and collect stamps. So he was the real stamp collector of the royal family, but they've carried on since. And included in the collection, I mean, there's some particularly high value items which he purchased privately while he was the Prince of Wales. He sort of set the record for the most expensive stamp at one point, which he purchased. But there were also stamps included in the collection. So George VI in 1939 went on a trip, state visit to Canada, of which he was king, and also visited the United States. But while he was in Canada, he was presented by the government of Canada with a full mint collection of Canadian stamps from I think 1868, sort of relatively early, kind of in philatelic history, which sort of begins in 1840, all the way up to 1939, and that was a full mint collection, and that went straight into the Royal Philatelic Collection. But even more recently, so in 2016, to mark Elizabeth's 90th birthday, I found that the state of Laos, their post office, they had there was a British woman living in Laos who became the first foreign national to design a stamp for the Lao Post. It's of two Lao girls, one dressed in sort of traditional wear, one in modern schoolgirl, and they're looking at the Buddha. It's very nice, but it was the first one done foreign and by a foreign citizen, and they decided they would have it sent to the Queen to mark her birthday as a gift from the Lao Post Office, which I'm sure she appreciated, so much so that her ambassador, on the approval of the Foreign Office and the Palace, accepted it on her behalf at the British Embassy in Laos capital on a special event to mark her birthday, saying that it would be accepted and put into the Royal Philatelic Collection. So this is a case of a British civil servant literally accepting a gift on behalf of the Queen to go into her private collection. It is a really clear-cut example of something which has come from a foreign state ending up in private hands. And the Palace completely refused to engage at all with the many questions I sent them on the Philatelic Collection, just a blanket refusal that it's private, so they won't say anything.
But sometimes we can make deductions from refusals to comment. So they're not disputing, are they, Henry, that these were official gifts from Laos and Canada? And they're not disputing that these are in the private property, or were in the private property of Her Majesty the Queen, and now assumed to be the private property of King Charles. So how does that square with the gift policy?
So we actually do know that it is now on the private property of Charles, because the collection is very difficult to see as a member of the public. It is shown, there is a very, very small amount of it shown at the Royal Philatelic Society of London to its members once a year at the sort of beginning of their season. And it was meant to happen actually shortly after the Queen's death. And so it got delayed and then was rescheduled for earlier this year and was given by gracious permission of His Majesty the King. So we know that it's gone to him. As regards to the gift policy, so the gift policy, the most recent version of the gift policy you can find, or so I can find on the Royal website, comes from 2003. And intriguingly, the gift policy mentions that it is kept subject to regular review to ensure that they continue to reflect best practice and prevailing circumstances. And yet nothing seems to have happened to it in the past 20 years, which is quite astonishing for that sort of document. So to take a comparison, Parliament, there's a policy on the acceptance of gifts for MPs, and that's reviewed regularly, and then does get updated in terms of the thresholds and the way that things should be declared. That's been updated several times in the past decade alone. Whereas in 20 years, there's been no change at all, it seems, to the gift policy. We also have no idea what the gift policy was when it was first introduced in 1995. So there's a sort of long period of obscurity there.
But irrespective of the fact that gift policy is maybe out of date, could be updated, the policy itself does say, does it not, that if you receive an official gift from a foreign state, it's not your private property. You shouldn't treat it as your private property. You can't sell it. You can't own it. It belongs to the nation. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Intriguingly, they also do get a kind of special exemption for, well, you can't sell it, you can't own it, but you can use it. We were speaking earlier about Buckingham Palace. The state owns Buckingham Palace, but it is used by the Windsors. So it is very much a have their cake and eat it type situation with the gift policy. But even that doesn't seem necessarily to be quite good enough, that they want to really fully own the cake in this really awful metaphor of mine.
You're inverting the let them eat cake metaphor. Anyway, I'm interested, Henry, that you mentioned this comparison with Westminster, because you cover politics as well, and money in politics, and you spent a lot of time thinking about accountability in Westminster. How does that compare? Reporting and asking difficult questions of politicians or government departments and the royal family and Buckingham Palace. Like how would you compare the two?
It's completely different. I mean, we were talking earlier today about the fact that Princess Anne had given this broadcast interview in Canada, but you know, I would be amazed if we see say a broadcast interview with Charles shortly after his coronation. But you'd be amazed if, upon the appointment of a new prime minister, there wasn't an interview with broadcasters shortly after for someone of that significance. And yet we know that the head of state has powers that they can exercise, but there's not that level of engagement with the media in that regard. In terms of publication of data, I mean, Whitehall has many flaws, but they do try and publish data on gifts, for instance, on a sort of quarterly basis. Sometimes that gets delayed, takes up to 6 months, a year. The royals seem to do it sort of as and when they please. It's difficult to get that data out of them. It's also very difficult to get them to say, for instance, as we encountered, what have you been doing? Could you please tell us how many engagements you've done? So, you know, Maeve, you had to go down to Datchet to go speak to a 91-year-old man who has been reading the Times every day and taking cuttings out of the paper in order to calculate on an annual basis what each working royal has actually been getting up to. If you were to apply that level, if we were to say that, oh, that would be entirely acceptable for MPs, which have no idea what they were doing, there would be public outrage at that idea of that level of secrecy. But the royals, who also receive public money and are seen as very much like to portray themselves as public servants, don't feel the need to have that level of transparency.
I'm going to throw this to all of you. Whoever wants to answer it can answer it. But just on this last point that Henry's mentioning about the relative lack of transparency, how have Buckingham Palace responded to questions around royal wealth and finances? You can all smile, but one of you has to say something.
Go on, shall I? I'll take that one, given that I was the kind of point of contact for a lot of it. I mean, I'll try to be neutral. I mean, their general policy is that they're not going to comment, and that this is the reason for that, to the extent that they articulate it, is that this is a private wealth, therefore it's a private matter, and that's the same as it would be for any other person, not talking about the private assets. I mean, I think that's. Do you want me to unpick the problems with that? Or
it's not the lack of engagement. I don't think is limited to questions around private wealth. Doesn't seem they've been particularly forthcoming on other matters. I mean, Henry was just pointing out the very basic question around what it is precisely that each of the working royals do, what they get paid. Really basic questions around specific items and who owns them. Even when they're owned by the sovereign in right of the crown. In other words, as close as you can get to for the benefit of the public or the nation, still we're not really getting answers to those questions.
That's right. I mean, Henry's point of comparison with MPs is a really good one to make, I think, because it's so revealing in the contrast. I mean, the sort of unwillingness to disclose information about engagements, as and when is kind of one thing, but I think there are other elements to what they won't address, which is questions about, well, what is private and what is public. I mean, we're confronted by this huge problem of trying to work out what we should be looking at, and we don't want to include stuff that we shouldn't. So we've very often gone to the palace and said, look, these are all the bits of jewelry that we're aware of, or these are all bits of art that we're aware of. Which bits are owned by the nation, so we can remove those. And they won't answer. It's completely incredible. So they're now in a position where they effectively refuse to comment to the British, to the public, on what the public, on what the king supposedly holds on the public's behalf. I mean, quite how this is sustainable, I don't really know. I mean, the only other point that I would make, which I think the others probably hopefully would agree on, is that I think it's not just what they don't disclose, but it's the manner in which they don't disclose it. I mean, they are very terse. You know?
It's you know, the old mantra is never complain, never explain, but it does go beyond that to just never say anything ever unless absolutely forced to, which, you know, I mean, I think their response on slavery, for instance, was an area where they did feel the need to actually say something, but otherwise it was just kind of, they didn't feel our questions weren't worthy.
Well, let's talk about that aspect of it, because I mentioned at the top, Maeve, you have this fantastic podcast series which is out this week on Today in Focus, a new episode every day, and tomorrow you have an episode dedicated to the reporting that our colleague David Conn did on the royal family's extensive links to the enslavement of African people, and in particular one crucial document that he uncovered with the help of, well, a historian uncovered it and David helped publicized it, showing a share transfer link from the slave trader Edward Colston to William III. And that initiated a different kind of response from the palace, right? They did actually engage in a substantial way to that reporting.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that was a kind of sit up and take notice moment from us, because we had just been getting almost these kind of cut and paste boilerplate responses. But when David goes to them and says, you know, this historian has found this document, and it's Edward Colston, who people might remember his statue was torn down in Bristol. This is kind of the notorious symbol of Britain's culpability and connection to the transatlantic slave trade. When Brooke Newman, this historian, finds this document that shows Colston transferring these shares to William III, and therefore William III benefiting and being, you know, deeply, deeply linked to the Royal African Company, this company that captured and transported nearly 200,000 enslaved people across the seas. He lays all that out to the palace, and we get this response, which is that the king has actually put his support behind some research into this area, into the connections between the monarchy and the transatlantic slave trade over a specific period, the 17th and 18th century. And this support kind of boils down to being open with this PhD researcher, Camilla de Koning, who's at Manchester University, and giving her access to the Royal Archives and the Royal Collection so she can do this research. So it was one of the rare opportunities where their response actually helped us in the story and became the story, and allowed David to break that news that review is happening.
And David Conn's work on the relationship between the royals and slavery showed it way beyond just that one document. You know, I think about a dozen monarchs over 200 years supported and sponsored and profited from slave trade. But that was a somewhat unique aspect of this project, in that it looked backwards. Most of what you guys and your colleagues were doing, in fact, we should mention our colleagues because they all worked extremely hard on this project. If I try to mention them all by name, I'll forget them all, which is how I'm just going to say in general. Thank you to all of them. But in terms of what the work we all collectively trying to do here was looking at the royal family today, right? And the various aspects of public financing, so the public money that goes to the royal family in the shape of the sovereign grant, which we haven't spoken about yet, but there may be some questions around that. Also the big private income dividends, essentially, that they get from these medieval fiefdoms, the Duchy of Cornwall and the Duchy of Lancaster, and then all of their various private assets. You know, that's what we set out to do. That's what David said at the top was so difficult. And it was difficult, but David, we sort of got there in the end, right? And that we produced what we would like to think. I think looking at what has been done before, this is true, is probably the most exhaustive audit of King Charles's wealth. Let's just talk us briefly through the sort of constituent parts of his net worth and the figure that we got to.
Sure. So we've looked at, I think you can't precisely remember. I can just try to enumerate some of them now. But the assets that we looked at, all told, include private property portfolio, private jewellery collection, private art collection, cars, horses, stamps, the Duchy of Lancaster, which you just mentioned. I'm probably forgetting something as well. All of shares, yeah, all of which require a sort of different way of assessing them. And we sort of consulted about, I think it was about a dozen all told, different experts to get some advice on these kind of very different fields. You know, valuing one is very unlike valuing another, and there's limits about how far you can go and what assumptions you can make. There's also different degrees of information that's available about each of them, but which, as I said earlier, was part of the challenge. I mean, all told, the figure we reached was 1.8 billion, which is, you know, plainly a very large sum of money to have in private wealth. It's significantly larger than another estimate by the Sunday Times. And that's partly because there are different ways of analysing and assessing it. But it's, I think, also because we have been quite aggressive in terms of trying to be as broad as we can in including these different asset types. I mean, previous estimates do tend to leave bits and pieces of it off. So, I mean, in terms of, sorry, do you want to go on about kind of why that matters?
Well, I do, because I think just for the audience's benefit, one of the conversations we had often as a team as we were doing this was, actually, what does it really matter what the total figure is? And we would have this discussion among ourselves. You know, does it matter if King Charles's net worth is 1.8 billion or 1.2 billion or less than a billion or 5 billion? I mean, you know, these are all enormous sums. To any ordinary person would be life transforming. It's a lot for a head of state to have. But the question really is, what did we glean from the journey in trying to find out as much as we could about both public and private wealth? So that was the question I was going to pose to you. And we got to this figure 1.8, and David, tell us your thoughts, but Maeve, Henry, you might have thoughts too about what the process of to use that horrible investigative cliche, following the money. What did that journey tell us about the royal family? I
mean, at a very basic level, I mean, it doesn't sort of get more complicated than we just sort of ought to know. I mean, I think we just ought to know that to what extent the head of state is a wealthy individual. It's now, we talked earlier about the comparison with MPs. I mean, MPs now, and you know, cabinet ministers will, you know, have to declare everything about what they're doing. Maybe not everything, but a great deal of information. And you get cabinet ministers disclosing details from their tax returns and things like this. I mean, these are people who have other kind of lives outside politics. They don't spend their whole life in a political role.
But ought to know why. So why do we know when it's the case of an elected public figure, an MP, or if it's unelected but a member of the House of Lords? Like, on what basis is it important that we know?
Two, really. The first of which is that this is public money. Bluntly, I mean, the king is, and the monarch generally is, and the royal family is a beneficiary of public money in a way that no other person is. The king is literally, he doesn't have some other job, you know, that where he's getting kind of, you know, a paycheck from, as far as we can tell. And so all of the finances that he's financed, you know, by the taxpayer from cradle to grave. You know, that's not true of anyone else. And it's why
his private wealth, to a significant extent, is derived from public money.
Yes, in that either it's paid out of a stipend or it's paid out of the duchies, which are kind of, there's been a long-standing argument should be treated as revenues in the same way that the Crown Estate is, which goes into the Treasury, or it's inherited from previous monarchs who had a similar, if not greater, enmeshment with the finances of the nation. So this argument that the palace likes to trot out, that it's, you know, just treating it private like anyone else, is not right. He's not like anyone else. His finances are public in a way that nobody else's can be. But the second, and I think more important reason, other than just simply there should be accountability around public money, is a more tricky question about the monarchy, and which, you know, even on its own terms, exists by virtue of public consent. That consent has to be, you know, honestly informed. You can't have public consent for an institution that is evasive and secretive about its role, about its relationship with the state that it represents. You can't, I would argue, I mean, I don't think you can't secure public consent for an institution whilst also refusing to answer, frankly, quite basic questions. And I think it becomes much. I think on the monarchy's own terms, if it truly believes in this, that it survives by consent, that consent has to be informed. You know, there has to be a respectful relationship with the public in a sense.
Do any of you think there are risks, lingering risks of perceived or actual conflict of interest that might derive from aspects of royal wealth, and that the public should know for that reason?
Yes, I mean, so we took some research done by the Times in 1993 into the Queen's investment into FTSE 100 companies. She was invested into about half the FTSE 100 through Bank of England nominees, and I think we sort of estimated that had it just gone into sort of FTSE 100 tracker, those funds worth about 110 million pounds now today. The head of state gets red boxes on a daily basis, works on the red boxes on a daily basis, which contain government sensitive information, which contains market sensitive information, which could have a serious impact on the value of their investments. Now, there's no suggestion that, you know, the Queen ever or the King ever misused that information, but it is a risk. It is a potential risk, and in any other walk of public life would be a significant enough potential risk that not only would they probably have to declare their shareholdings, they probably have to put them into a blind trust and have no ability to, you know, have any say over their sale or indeed what they were. You know, if the Chancellor had a huge share portfolio which they had direct control over, while also having significant control over, you know, financial policy, then there would be justifiable outrage at that. And there is the same risk with the monarchy head of state there.
Maeve, I see you nodding.
Yeah, well, and also we've seen examples of that, right? With Charles when he was Prince Charles, and the Black Spider memos, and him writing to people and lobbying essentially. And there's no suggestion that that was because of any, you know, undue influence that he was getting, but there is a power there that comes from being in the royal family, and the conversations that you can start that could be subtly influenced by where your money's coming from, by the friends you have, by the lavish gifts that they give you.
That's a very good point. And it neatly concludes the 40 minutes I'd in my mind allocated for me asking the three of you questions, and we can segue now to questions that come from people who are listening, the audience. So just a reminder, if you do have questions, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. You can ask the question, it'll appear on a screen here for me, and I will do my best to get through as many questions as possible and relay them to Maeve, Henry and David. So I actually have one here from Greg Young, and I think Maeve, you would be a good person for this. Greg asks, it's not an easy question, it's not a simple question, but how many royals are there? And perhaps there's a distinction there between working royals and non-working royals, and how much do they cost us?
So we know with working royals, there's 11 of them, and they are the ones that you know that will go out and open fetes and factories and be patrons of charities and the like. As Henry mentioned earlier, it should be easy enough to know what it is that they do, because there is something called a court circular that's published every day that outlines what they do, but that isn't collated in any simple way, except for by this fabulous 91-year-old man in Datchet who's been making these scrapbooks. So we have a sense from that of what they do. They are generally paid, the sovereign grant comes to the monarch, and he now will divvy that up, and that goes towards the kind of running costs and the staff costs, and keeping the working royals working, as does the income that's coming from the duchies and other places. So between this, something like 120 million pounds a year that the king is getting from the duchies and from the sovereign grant, he can pay for these working royals to keep working. And by looking back through the accounts, we got a sense of how much they get how much they got over time. So Prince Andrew, for example, got £13 million over 40 years. He was doing a lot, averaging about 400 events a year, but obviously that has now cut back since he stepped back from public life. And then there's lots of working royals who you might not have heard of: the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, Princess Alexandra, Princess Michael of Kent. All of these people that are getting millions and millions of pounds and doing these events. But I guess there's questions on how useful that is. And Charles has now indicated that he might slim down the number of working royals. Though how to do that without annoying people and causing a bit of a ruckus is yet to be seen.
Sorry, Henry. Yes.
Just on on the payments to the royals too. This is another example of where the majority of public life has gone one way and the royals have gone the other. So since the sovereign grant came in, we basically have 13 years of guesswork as to how much each royal has received, sort of in exchange for the work that they do. Previously, through the civil list, it was published, it was debated in Parliament, and you would know how much each specific working royal got. But since the sovereign grant came in, that hasn't happened. Whereas, sort of in the past 15 years, so especially in Parliament, post the MPs' expenses scandal, there's been so much more information available about how much money MPs get. You can see sort of every single penny that an MP spends on stationery, if you want to, but you can't even work out how much money Prince William gets paid to do his job.
We have had two related questions to this, which I just want to throw into the bucket. And I don't know who's going to answer them, but it could be any of you. So Jacqueline Rolfe asks about the flip side of the coin. She says that the royals don't just cost the country, but they also produce income, revenues. We've all heard the talking point, the argument that the royal family bring a lot of money from tourism. That's a very difficult thing to measure. Is there any reliable audit of money that the royal family bring into the country? Is that something that can be measured? I can
start speaking to that. So yeah, that is definitely something that gets mentioned a lot, this kind of tourism argument, and it's often based on a particular report that came out in 2017 by an organisation called Brand Finance that said they bring all of this wealth into the country through these ways. But when I looked at Visit Britain's top 10 or even maybe top 20 things to do, like most popular tourist attractions, there was nothing royal related on it, unless you count the V&A, which is really just in name. So there's not really evidence to back that up. And actually, the campaign group Republic did a pretty good job at debunking that on a YouTube video, kind of going through each point and saying these are very intangible benefits that we're talking about. And if you look at Versailles in France, visited by many millions of people a year, and they haven't had a monarch living there for quite some time. So it's slightly unknown, but there isn't really hard evidence to suggest that they are bringing benefits that way.
Okay, sorry.
Can I add one thing to that? Because it made me have a massive bugbear about this. Maybe you're entirely right, obviously, and I wouldn't disagree with any of that. But I also find the argument itself completely and utterly bewildering, and sort of weirdly defensive. The idea that you would sort of choose your constitutional arrangements based on what is best for the tourism industry is just does any other country do that? I could definitely think of more entertaining things we could do if we wanted to increase the ticket take off the back of our constitutional arrangements. So it's just so insane as an argument when you think about it. There are good arguments for, there are reasonable arguments for maintaining a monarchy around political stability and continuity in history and that sort of thing. The tourism one, I'm genuinely baffled every time I hear it.
Yeah.
Just
okay.
And very quickly on tourism too. I think
you all, so finishes up.
I think Legoland Windsor gets more visitors than Windsor Castle. So maybe we should have a Lego head of state, by that logic.
Okay, you've collectively dismantled that palace talking point. Anyway, let's move on to another question. There have been a few on the same subject, so I'm going to try to sort of amalgamate them. There is, let me see, Andrew Kledzik, who is asking more information about this is difficult because they're also similar sounding, but the Crown Estate, which is one thing, the Duchy of Lancaster, which is another estate but very different, and the Duchy of Cornwall. David Pegg, I think that would be a question for you. And if I could just throw in another question, because there is another question about the duchies. We've talked about them a lot in this hour, but maybe we haven't really properly explained what they are. We have a question saying, are the duchies inherited family wealth and therefore not subject to public oversight? So could you just explain to us, give us a quick primer on the duchies and the Crown Estate, the differences between the two?
Okay, I'll try and do this as kind of quickly and simply as I possibly can, because it's so hard to understand. There are no other entities like the duchies. They are effectively sort of hereditary property investment firms, is effectively what they have become now. They were created sort of hundreds of years ago by sort of Henry III. I think the Duchy of Lancaster was created using lands that he'd seized from putting down some baron somewhere. And declared would be kind of in perpetuity the sort of private property of the monarch, and would generate him. It would be a kind of private estate for the monarch's personal use. They have then sort of subsisted and existed in various forms since then. The big change that came along in the 18th century was the surrender of what was called the Crown lands. So the majority of the lands that were owned in terms by the monarchy were handed over to Parliament in exchange for an annual stipend. This was effectively in the course of the development of the nation and the country simply becoming a more complex organization than what a feudal system could sustain. You were now having to raise taxes and spend it on things. It was all getting quite complicated. The king handed over the Crown lands to Parliament, also handing over responsibility for the finances of the nation. So that has now become what's called the Crown Estate. It is effectively a national property company. It's got a very large number of assets. It owns all the foreshore around the United Kingdom and that sort of thing. There are then these two other hereditary estates, the Duchy of Lancaster, which belongs always to the monarch, and the Duchy of Cornwall, which belongs always to the heir to the throne. The question asked if they were sort of inherited wealth, to which the answer is yes, but it's complicated. They're not privately owned by the monarch. They are owned by the monarch. So Duchy of Lancaster is owned by the monarch in right of being the Duke of Lancaster, which is not the same thing as being Charles Windsor. Similarly, he for years was associated obviously with the Duchy of Cornwall, Duchy Originals and all of that. That's now gone to Prince William, because it's always associated with the heir to the throne. What is interesting about them is that during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, in a way that is completely and utterly unprecedented, and which is really genuinely very new, is they have been transformed from what were effectively quite boring agricultural estates. I mean, they were just large numbers of fields and agricultural land, which didn't generate a lot of money, into organizations that are much more commercial, much more aggressive, and most significantly, don't pay any corporation tax, which make them hugely profitable. And those profits are paid out every single year to the monarch and the heir to the throne. And last year they were £21 million apiece. So this is a very, very rich seam of, cash.
And just very briefly, you mentioned the duchies themselves don't pay corporation tax or capital gains tax. But there are some questions about royals and tax generally. Maeve mentioned that they don't pay inheritance tax when something's passed from monarch to monarch. But what other taxes do the royals pay? And do we know precisely how much they pay in tax and at what rate?
Do you want me to take this one?
Very quickly, yeah.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, so following and after the Windsor Castle fire in 1992, when it was sort of put about that the public would be paying for the restoration, it all got a bit sweaty and people got quite cross. And as a result of that, a deal was struck between the monarchy and the Prime Minister, John Major, to the effect that they would start paying income tax. Previously, they hadn't paid any income tax on their income. However, so yes, effectively, the agreement states that they will pay income tax in the same way as everyone else does. The tax returns themselves are not public, So we don't know what expenses they're offsetting against that, or whether that reduces it to zero, or we know literally nothing about it. Again, that is then protected by another sort of wall of secrecy. But it was part of the same deal that said they weren't going to have to pay inheritance tax. It's the flip side of the coin.
Yeah.
So to the extent that they have started to pay, it is still an unbelievably sweet deal.
Okay. Let's switch to another topic. Maeve, I'm going to throw this one to you. It's always a bit of a tricky one when people ask about activism and action, because as we all know, we're always quite cautious to just stick to the facts and exposing them. But somebody called Kathy G says, it's interesting to learn all of these details, but what action do the panel think would be a good outcome from this investigation? And then related to that, Rob Hull says, in response to your reporting, what is the likelihood of the Windsors conceding more accountability, stroke transparency, or even handing back some private wealth?
Yeah, these are really good questions, and they're the kind of questions, I guess, that we hoped this reporting would prompt. Not necessarily ones that we feel like we should answer, but certainly ones that, you know, we hope that this would start a debate, like David said so eloquently, so that people would have the information to make that informed consent about the monarchy, at the very least, so we can watch the coronation at the weekend with the proper context of, you know, where these gold carriages are coming from and exactly which jewels in the crown are whose. So the Guardian's position generally is, you know, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Paul, but that we would welcome seeing a republic, but we appreciate that that's a kind of gradual move that might happen down the line. We're not thinking that would happen overnight. And obviously people have different personal opinions on that, but I think just the real basic element of getting information out there, calling for more transparency and hoping for a debate. You know, there have been public debates in the past, televised debates about whether we still want a monarchy. And at this moment of transition, it feels like this is the time to do it, because the danger is we kind of sleepwalk into things carrying on just the same way that they always have, without any real scrutiny or questioning of why we're doing that.
And just on that, and on, you know, the country's view of the monarchy at the moment, I'm seeing, and I'm sorry we haven't had time to go through all of the questions, and there have been many that people have submitted, but I have just noticed scrolling through the questions, we've got audience members all over the world, someone here from Canada, someone else from Portugal, and all of this does look very odd when you look at it from overseas. One of the questions we had actually was about public sentiment in the UK. Henry, I don't know if you know the answer to this. Heidi Yamaguchi asks, what proportion of UK citizens want to retain the monarchy, and what proportion do not, or simply do not care or stroke have an opinion?
Yeah, so I don't believe we've actually done any polling on this, but there has been some recent polling in other British newspapers recently. So today, for instance, today's Daily Mail contains polling from Lord Ashcroft, who does a lot of political polling. All polling today always has to sort of break people down into groups. Pollsters love groups now. And so Ashcroft has got this polling which breaks down into these 5 groups. 7% are the committed royalists, 32% are the mainstream monarchists. So I guess that's kind of 39% are the sort of more active monarchists. 24% is the neutral pragmatists, who are sort of in favour of the status quo because they don't quite know what would replace it. And then 19% modern Republicans and 18% are angry abstentionists. This is according to Lord Ashcroft's analysis. So that's 37% Republicans. So, you know, if we kind of take the status quo people as a sort of undecided or don't know, or there's not quite enough information on what the future might look like, then it's actually, you know, it's very similar. It's 39% monarchist, 37% Republican. But there's some other polling. YouGov for the Times suggested, you know, sort of very much today, 60% would continue with the monarchy, 26% would want to move to an elected head of state, and 15% don't know. But with a lot of this too, an interesting aspect of it is the generational divide. So, you know, obviously the younger you get, the less support you find for the monarchy. And actually, I think one of the more interesting questions in Ashcroft's polling was, they asked, if there's a referendum tomorrow, would you keep the monarchy? And there's 56% yes, 23% no, and 21% don't know. So that's broadly in line with what the Times found. You know, sort of 60% yes in favour of the monarchy. But Ashcroft asked, what about in 10 years? You know, how would you vote in 10 years, do you think? And there, the favour in favour of the monarchy goes from 56% to 35%. And the number of people who don't know goes up to 35%. And then in 50 years, by 50 years, it's down to, I think, 20%, and then 42% don't know. I mean, you know, it's really hypothetical, but it's to some extent is that kind of very British tradition of kicking the can down the line. You know, we'll wait and see what happens, and this very understandable sort of sense of uncertainty as to, you know, the monarchy has been at the centre of the British Constitution for centuries, and what would we have to replace it? It's very difficult to visualise and then to think about. So I think it's easier to go for don't know than to kind of ardently be in favour of a republic when you're not quite sure what the shape of that republic might be.
Well, and only just to point out, you know, it's not just people in Britain's opinion that matter, right? The monarch is the figurehead for many, many countries around the world, and we're seeing there in the Commonwealth countries attitudes changing quite dramatically, whereas people seem to really like the Queen as a person, or at least tolerated the Queen as a person. This new king seems to be a lot less popular. We've already seen Barbados, you know, moving away from having the monarch as head of state, and potentially other countries that will happen as well.
Last question. We've had various questions interestingly asking about other people's coverage of the cost of the crown and whether other media have been following up our reporting. And I think there has, to the issue that Maeve has just been talking about, been a difference, David, with respect to domestic or UK-based publications and the international media on this topic.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, broadly speaking, I mean, it certainly has been mentioned and picked up by other publications, not necessarily kind of sort of with glowing favoritism, which is only reasonable because there are rivals commercially. But in terms of follow-up, I mean, we've been speaking to quite a lot of foreign media over the course of the week, answering questions about it, explaining it, and the process of doing it. And I think, you know, that's in part because, I mean, it represents what Maeve was saying, which is that we tend to kind of think of this as this quite sort of parochial British event, but it's not. It's a really significant Commonwealth event, and it's a really significant international event as well. There is going to be a lot of international interest. But so on the one hand, it speaks to that, but I think on the other hand, it speaks to there has traditionally been a sort of an enormous amount of deference towards the monarchy, and a sort of general unwillingness to ask quite difficult questions in a way that we ordinarily would of politicians. I mean, and you know, other newspapers generally will give politicians a very hard time, but the monarchy has sort of, for reasons that nobody quite understands, I don't understand completely, has largely escaped that. I mean, I think it to a sense, you said some of this stuff, you know, feudal estates that pay money without having any tax and this sort of thing does seem extremely weird when you just put it in terms and you're viewing it from outside the box. I think one of the things that we've hoped to remedy over the course of doing this series is this sense that, you know, there's this sort of large sort of subject that hasn't been tackled, that sits right at the center of our political life.
Well, that is a good point to end on, David, and partly because I think one of the it's not a question, it's a comment, but it's a much appreciated comment from Andrew, who says, thank you for opening the lid on one of the subjects that has been bothering me for years. And thank you for the comment, Andrew. It's really nice when people say thank you. It's also really gratifying to work at a news organisation that allows us to lift the lid on thorny topics like this, subjects that other media, frankly, to David Pegg's point, just for whatever reason, don't touch. The Guardian is quite unique in that way. There's no stone we can't turn over. You know, we don't have a proprietor. We are not state-sponsored. We can investigate anything that we think deserves a difficult, hard look. And so the royal family has had our attention in recent months. It will continue to do so in the future. It's been great talking to you all. We always appreciate your feedback. So if you have thoughts on this event, how it went, positive or negative, don't hesitate to fill in the survey that will pop up on your screen once this event closes. But other than that, thank you very much for joining us this evening. We hope you come to future events. Thank you.